I am Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And we're paranormal specialists who live in the most haunted city on earth, Savannah, Georgia. Every day is Halloween in our line of work, so join us as we spin true tales of haunts, murders, and disturbing Savannah history. I'm Madison.
I'm Chris.
And welcome to the most haunted city on earth. Hello, and welcome to a bonus episode of the most haunted city on earth. My name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And JT is here also.
Hello.
So we are, as always, going to be answering your questions today. If you did not answer a question or ask a question this week, please feel free to ask us a question on TikTok through our Q&A button. Also, you can comment on our YouTube videos or things of that nature. But if you do have any questions, we do answer them every week, and I come through everything. So definitely, if you want something pressing to be answered, utilize that Q&A button. Well, let's go ahead and dive into these questions.
All right, so the first question is, what do you think about man-made ghosts? Meaning, if a lot of people focus, they can create an entity. Do you think popular ghosts can be affected this way? Don't trust the creeps, Ron asked that.
Don't trust those creeps, Ron.
Absolutely. I 100% believe that ghosts can be manufactured by a system of belief and a series of retellings and investments. And, we see it all the time where, recently we spoke about this, the Black-Eyed Kids was one, and these urban legends that come about, and then people actually start having these experiences and they start attributing them to these entities. I have had a long-standing theory that ghosts eventually lose their identities, that they tend to lose who they were over time, and they become shadows. I think that that's kind of what a shadow figure is. In many instances, what you're really looking at is a spirit that has lost identity, and it craves identity. And if you give certain thoughts towards an identity, that shadow will do its best to form into the constraints of the identity you give it. If you have a shadow figure somewhere around you and you start to formulate an idea of what it is, it will do its best to be what you expect, so that you will continue to interact with it, so you will continue to give it form and function. And I think that's why many times there were accounts of people seeing the devil, and he would be in that outlandish red with horns and tail, which is not necessarily anything more than an artistic depiction of the devil. Mm-hmm. But because so many people accepted that as what the devil looked like, when these shadow figures would appear and people feared them and said, oh, it's the devil, the only devil that could be conjured was this image that most people accepted as the devil. And, Slender Man is a great example. There are people who claim to have seen and experienced a Slender Man encounter. And I think that is because in their mind dwelled this entity. And when they saw something that they couldn't explain, they transposed it onto the thing they couldn't explain. The human mind is an incredibly powerful thing. It determines what reality is. And for those people who don't accept that we are truly responsible for the reality that we exist in, it's by consensus. Just know that most of the universe is unknown variable. Less than 1% of everything that we experience, or what we experience, is less than 1% of the variables that are involved in the universe. So, yeah, I think we absolutely have the ability to manufacture spirits. There's even an experiment where they contrived a ghost story, but they did not tell the participants. Do you remember this?
I feel like I vaguely...
I think it was in Canada.
Yeah.
So the unfortunate nature is we don't research before we come onto the podcast. So we're like grasping at these straws. The basic story was it was a paranormal investigator or a person who was possibly trying to debunk paranormal investigation, but basically he made up a ghost story. And then he invited people into a house, and without telling them the ghost story he made up, somehow they were able to divine the conditions of the ghost story that he had made up. Mm-hmm. And this really does give us kind of an example of how much intention and how much our own ability to perceive plays into paranormal activity.
Yeah, we don't see these questions usually ahead of time. Well, at least Chris doesn't. So, you're definitely getting our honest reaction to a lot of these. But I also agree. I think one of the biggest examples of this could be, in my opinion, the man with the hat.
Oh, yes.
I personally have experienced the man with the hat when I was a child, and so did my little sister. We didn't realize it until we were maybe like 6 years ago. And she brought up to me, she was like, I had a ghost experience once. You're not the only one who could see them, I guess, And so I was like, well, what did you see? And she goes, well, at night, the man with the hat would stand in my doorway, and that's why I sleep with my door closed. I'm like, that's the reason why I sleep with my door closed. Because I would wake up in the middle of the night and see this tall, shadowy man with a big hat on, a top hat, and he'd stand in my doorway. And then he'd turn and walk over towards my sister's room, which would make a lot of sense why we both saw it. But I think with the legend of that, because I didn't realize that this was like a common experience for people until I really started getting into paranormal theory and whatnot. But I feel like because so many people have shadow people around them, and we all just kind of collectively decided that there's this figure of the man with the hat, and it's kind of created more men with hats of sorts.
Well, yeah, and it's fascinating because a lot of times just the fact that we've coined it the man in a hat, because I've heard he's wearing a bowler hat. I've heard he's wearing a wide brimmed hat. I've heard some people think that it's literally like a pilgrim's hat, so super wide brimmed hat.
Yeah.
Top hat is probably the one that I hear the most, but I've heard fedora. I've heard these things because when you say man in a hat, what pops into your head is not going to be the same hat as everybody else. Because I had a friend who had a man in a hat situation in his house where the sinks would turn on. And another interesting thing, because the one that really intrigues me about your story is I've heard many man in a hat stories where he's standing at the threshold of the bedroom door. He's not in the room, he's like in the hall.
Yeah.
He's all like a hallway ghost.
Yes.
But in this case, he would turn the sinks on and then turn them off. Turning a sink on is not as big a deal because apparently when your washers in your sinks are loose, the pressure from the water can turn them and they'll come on. But turning them off, that is not, because the pressure is pushing against, I don't know how plumbing works, so don't come at me. But apparently when the washers are loose, water pressing against them can turn them on, but they do not turn off. And one night I was house sitting for him, and I heard the sink come on in the bathroom, so I went in to turn it off. And as I walked up to the sink, it just shut right off. And I was like, oh, man in the hat, gotta go.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting collective experience that people have had. So in my opinion, I feel like that would be one of the most interesting and most well-known man-made spirits. But
sure. Yeah. For the people who do not know the man in the hat, why don't you tell them?
Yeah, so the man in the hat it's kind of interesting to go into because basically it's supposed to be like the shadowy man, and like Chris said, he is wearing any variable of hats, but he doesn't communicate with you. He just watches, he just stares, and people report just having this person watching them every single night. And that was exactly my experience until I closed the door. And that way he couldn't get in, he couldn't watch me because he doesn't cross the thresholds, which is really interesting.
There's even like a famous statue of the man in a hat.
Think the Exorcist poster.
Yeah, basically.
Well, yeah, and it's very similar, yeah.
That leads credence to a lot of this concept of the supernatural purposes. Watching over you is as long as humans have been alive, they've had this concept of supernatural entities watching over us, guardian angels, the idea that the whole purpose of the other realm is to watch over us, is to somehow either protect us or at the very least catalog our lives, which is also very disturbing when you think of all the things you do when you're alone. You don't necessarily want to be watched every second of every day. So that intriguing concept, especially because it's a shadowy figure who's the idea is the brim of the hat creates a shadow over the face. Usually there are no features.
Yeah, absolutely none.
And the statue that I'm thinking of is literally like a hat and the body, but there's nothing in it. I think the hat's being held up by a scarf. But it's very interesting to think that there's countless encounters. And of course, there for a good deal of human history, men wore hats. Until the middle part of the 20th century, a hat was just a part of your everyday apparel. It was not abnormal to have a hat. In many professions, you were identified by your hat. So, that gives us a little context clue to the idea that, there's probably a lot of dead people with hats.
Oh, yeah.
Because for, as far back in the history, if you see a musketeer coming at you, you won't know unless he's wearing one of those hats. You're like, oh, some man in a tunic. No, wait, he's got a hat. It's a musketeer.
Yeah.
All righty, let's move on to the next question. And also, towards the end of this episode, I have a surprise for Chris and Madison, and I did not even tell them about it. So,
oh, great!
Wonderful. Wonderful.
That's not ominous at all.
Yeah.
So keep a lookout for that. Stay listening. All right. So, second question is
Top.
asks, why have you guys seen so many ghosts, but we don't have them on video?
That's a very good question. Well, I'll tell you, at least from my perspective, if I recorded every ghost that I see, I would just be on my phone all the time. To be quite honest, it's
Apple glasses. It's going to be a game changer.
But I will also tell you, in a lot of the more, I guess, strong entities that I've encountered, my first instinct is not to pull out my phone. My first instinct is like, whoa, okay, you are very present here, and I'm having this experience with you. I am also just not really a person who gravitates to my phone immediately for anything in general. So that is why. Also, paranormal experiences usually happen very quickly. So it can be a little tricky because it can happen in the blink of an eye and then it's gone. So you wouldn't even have necessarily time to take a photo, let alone pull out your camera and start a video. Things do happen where you accidentally catch things on camera, and that's how we get these ghost photos. And like the little boy at the end of the hall, we were on FaceTime, and it just happened to show up on that camera.
But if I am in the house, don't you worry, you're getting that bad boy on video.
JT is...
If I'm around and we're going to be doing more vlogs and stuff and all of that, if I'm around, we capturing it.
But yeah, that is kind of my personal belief of why we don't oftentimes see videos and stuff like that. And I know actually with specifically the little boy at the end of the hall in the Davenport house video, so many people are like, well, you got a photo, but you don't have a video. And I'm like, it was FaceTime. It was FaceTime.
Let me actually add in just super fast, just talking about it from a video like expert's perspective.
Sure.
When you're filming at 23.98 frames per second, okay? Or 24 frames per second. A lot of people have heard that, but that's the exact number, 23.98. So when you take a photo, that's just one frame, right? But then you're taking 23.98 in 1 second. And it makes me wonder, first, maybe they're only showing up in one frame, and you can't see one frame in 23.98 per second. Right? I mean, so I'm just thinking about this from a technical standpoint. What if ghosts only show up in one frame and video's just not the way to get them?
Yeah.
I wonder.
I mean, even in the question, because I, in 45 years of chasing ghosts, in and out of shadows, and 45 years of doing that, I only have a handful of actual sightings of my own, And of the many pictures and videos that I have taken, I've only got a handful of images out of countless encounters, countless times. So it's strange to think that we're seeing so many ghosts. The truth of the matter is, we're not. We are telling stories collectively of a lifetime of experiences. If I put all my stories into a big book, it's going to be like, oh my God, look at all these stories. But we're talking about decades and decades.
Yeah.
So, and then comes the fact that I don't care to catch them. I'm not in it for proof or for evidence. I'm in it for experience and story. I'm in it to experience something. And when somebody tells me something, I don't immediately grill them or cross-examine them or force them to give me receipts. I take the story and I'm like, that's a good story. And I'll repeat it if I like the story. And that's just it. I am not in it for proof because I don't need proof. I'm not trying to validate it for myself. I already believe. And I'm not trying to convince you. It doesn't matter. Other people's belief in what I see or feel or do has no bearing on my experience. It only has bearing on their interpretation of my experience, which they are absolutely welcome to. And I am never shy of skeptics or people who disbelieve or anything like that, because that's their experience. They're using their experience to inform whether or not they believe me. So I'll never be upset that someone doesn't believe me. And I definitely will never be like, well, here's the proof. That is a juvenile tactic for living your life, because that's technically what I'm trying to do, is just live my life pursuing the things that I'm enthusiastic about. Pursuing the supernatural realm is not for fame. It's not for anything like that. Even coming onto this podcast it's not my podcast. I was invited on.
Yeah, you're so part of the team, though.
No, I'm a part of the team. I'm not discounting being here, but I am saying that this was not necessarily the pursuit. It's because I have stories that I'm here. I'm very appreciative of it. But at the end of the day, I love looking at video footage and pictures. I love having those things, but they've never been the goal.
Absolutely.
My goal is not to have a catalog of evidence. My goal is to have a lot of good stories to tell.
I completely agree with that. If you ever go on like a ghost tour or a ghost investigation, I'm listening to the stories more so than I am, like snapping a million photos. I do take photos and stuff just in case if something pops up. But oftentimes, and this actually happened to me recently, and you'll hear about it on if you listen to our podcast with Emma from Real Life Ghost Stories.
That dropped last Saturday.
Yes. I was just at the Sorrel Weed House where I was taking a ghost tour and taking notes and stuff. I really wasn't taking very many photos because I was too busy taking notes on the stories and the accounts of what other people have experienced, and I still had an experience. So I'm just saying, and even when I had that experience, I was too busy trying to figure out, like, the heck was that, And over, like, let me pull out my phone and see if I can catch Sarah, the little girl that's hiding behind this antique wheelchair, Yeah,
no, it doesn't occur to you. That's another thing, is when you're in the midst of it, it doesn't occur to you. And, speaking differently than JT, because JT is this visual storyteller who dedicated time and study to the capturing of stories on video or on film. I, at core, am a writer. So all I'm concerned with is words and emotions and the capturing of any happenstance in words and spreading them to other people. So it doesn't occur immediately to me that I need some visual representation or I have to get this proof. Because again, if you believe, it's not as pressing. And a lot of ghost hunters who are very dedicated to it, and I'll put JT in that category, they are still looking for the validation. They're new to the belief of ghosts, and it needs foundation.
Yeah.
You see a ghost and you're like, oh, this is real, but it's very hard to dedicate yourself to something based on a single instance. It's very hard to dedicate yourself based on a single circumstance. So you see a lot of these very earnest ghost hunters who will put up all the equipment, get all the stuff, and work very diligently to get that evidence, because they are, in some degree, trying to prove it for themselves. They need that validation for their own experience, and that is perfectly valid. That is an important step. But if you've been at it for a long time, or if you've been inundated, there is a period where that probably was the case. I know that in my teen years, I was very vehement about going after ghosts and trying to catch ghosts and doing those things. The equipment was terrible, but and there was no, like, you couldn't go to the store and get a spirit box. Yeah. So we're all just like, we'll make our own Ouija board, we'll do scrying, we'll dowsing rods, which we made. So all of that comes down to the fact that when I was doing the most of my quote unquote ghost hunting, because I don't particularly care for the terms ghost hunter or ghost hunting. When I was doing it the most, I had the crappiest equipment. I had 35 shick, click, shick, no idea if anything was on, click. So yeah, I would say that I'm past the point of being dedicated to having video or photographic, or EVPs. I'm past the point where that is important to me. And I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying to me.
Absolutely.
I am not past it.
No, JT.
Totally
I will find them.
JT will be our video hound dog, and we are planning on doing some investigations.
Yeah.
And you will be able to witness for yourself that Madison and I are probably in the corner going, ooh. And JT's like, meh.
Actually, I'm pretty excited about this. I have built a ghost hunting video rig. I've been working like constantly acquiring different part lenses, different cameras, and all of that to have the perfect ghost hunting equipment rig for both photos and videos. So I am really gonna try, and I'm gonna actually make a video on Patreon telling y'all what that is, like all of the equipment.
I'm going to make a pitch live, never heard before. I'm pitching this to JT right here. I think that you should take your incredible 8K 360 camera and live stream from haunted places so that people can watch live different, like even this place. If you set up an overnight.
Oh, yeah.
And just like, from midnight to 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And then sell a subscription to watch, to tune in and watch. There was, it's the Winford Library? The Willard Library.
Yeah.
Used to have this thing where you could go on their website and watch their security cameras.
Oh, wow.
I love that.
And people would watch, and you would see this little message box of something moved over there, get over there, go, so, camera 4 at 3 a.m. And,
oh, wow.
But
it was just rats.
No, one time it was like book falling off of the shelf or a shadow walking across the thing. Wonderful, amazing things, but I do believe that because technology is so great, and a 360 camera would give you access to an entire room. Like you should get Greyface if you could.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah. I think that's a great idea.
So that was a live pitch here.
Live pitch.
Yeah, currently we only have our outdoor camera to catch our raccoon and our outdoor cats. But, if you want that content, they're all named after haunting things.
Do you remember the weird security system that I got? We actually made a horror movie a couple of years ago.
Yeah. I remember that.
That was an excellent tool because it was super cheap and it's night vision. You just rig it up.
Yeah.
And then,
we actually have Reolink cameras all around here. I just don't check them.
Well,
we filmed this place 24/7 for 60 days. It holds it.
You can open a subscription-based.
Oh man,
ghost
Patreon.
A virtual ghost hunt.
Yeah.
You log on.
That's not a bad idea.
You say what hours you're watching, and let people just watch.
I like it. I could.
It satisfies the ghost hunter. It satisfies the voyeur. It satisfies,
Yeah.
Because people just like to peer into places that they're not supposed to be. The after hours locked doors.
It's true. All right. So next question: can you do a theory on apartment ghosts? Sparkle _2121.
So I don't think that apartment ghosts have a particularly any difference than any other ghost. It's a place where people lived, oftentimes a place where people die. People die in apartments every day. It's where a lot of people commit suicide, where a lot of people are murdered, where there are endless amounts of reasons. So if you're asking just a generalized theory about apartment ghosts, apartments are no different than houses. You know, they are dwellings where people lived. And with that note, it's possible in an apartment that you could get any ghost from the building. It doesn't necessarily, you know, sometimes ghosts are just wandering the halls. I believe in there's a lot of homeless ghosts. And by homeless ghosts, I mean they don't have the registered, you know, oh, they were murdered in this spot. So they are just lingering. They're just here on this plane of existence, wandering around. And you might just be the most interesting thing. You know, a ghost might see you and be like, that energy is the energy that I want to be around, that I want to see. You know, you could have a situation where a person living in one apartment was loved by a person living in another apartment. That person died but spends all its time in the other apartment. Because it's frustrating when you get a ghost story and people are, and in Savannah you get a lot of people who are like, this is what's happening to me. And you're like, oh, well, you've got an old house. Try to find what happened in that house. I dare you, I double dog dare you to root through every possible newspaper article or anything.
Yeah.
There's no telling what happened in that house. And then on top of that, the ghost may not actually be attached to the location. It may have gotten there through an impulse. It may have gotten there, it may be lost, like literally lost. So there's all kinds of questions as to what makes an apartment ghost any different than like a house ghost. Why would an apartment ghost exist where a house ghost doesn't? In my mind, there's no difference in the conditions of haunting. You know, was it a violent death? Was it a unfinished business situation? Was their grave desecrated and therefore their spirit became dislodged from their place of rest? And where would they go? They would go to the place that they lived. And it could be just the place that they loved the most.
That's true.
You don't even have to be, it doesn't have to be the location of their death. It could be their happiest place. They could go back to the place where they were, 10 years old, and they're like, "That was the happiest time of my life." And it's an apartment that they haven't lived in since they were children.
Could a new apartment become haunted by a ghost, like an old ghost?
I mean, you can bring things into your apartment, things, attached to people. Our apartment was haunted for, but I mean, it was an old building, but like...
Old one, yeah.
There's actually a belief that new structures are very likely to be haunted. And there's one cultural aspect where there's a culture that believes that you shouldn't live in a newly built house. You should let it be empty for a year so that the ghost will lose interest. Because the ghost in a new build is preying on the new energy, on the excitement of coming into a house.
They want that super fast Wi-Fi.
Well, they want the elation of the people who come in, the joy of the family or the start of the family or that new, because there's so much when you first move into this empty house that has no competing spirits. There's nothing there, barring the door. And like I said, lots of homeless ghosts out there who are like, look at this beacon of joy. This is going to be their first purchase. This is going to be the new family home. This is people coming in, and to be a part of the participation of that does seem like, people are like, well, this is an ancient Indian burial ground. This isn't a murder house. This isn't that. None of those things are exclusive. They don't, it's not all or nothing. In a new build, what you're dealing with are oftentimes parasitic spirits. We were talking about that in another podcast. A parasitic spirit is especially quick to go to places where there's going to be high energy, where there's going to be high familial energy, high love, because the higher the energy, the less work it has to do to eat.
Yeah. Yes. Feed on energy, at least. Not eat people. But
not people, yeah.
I mean, unless it's a Wendigo, but still. But yeah, I completely agree. I don't think there's necessarily anything to an apartment that is specifically attracting spirits, but it is a number of different reasons. It could just be you, something wanted to be near you, or it could be a loved one that wanted to hang around. You never know. Our old apartment that we lived in had on our floor 2 spirits. One was like kind of showed up in our unit a lot, and he liked to lock me out of the apartment frequently, especially before I met you. It happened to me all the time. But
I have a theory about that.
oh yeah.
But go ahead.
But the one that was the most active though, and I don't know if I feel like you do remember this, is the spirit that was not human for sure, but it would pace in the hallway, and there was a motion sensor light in that hallway, so it would be pitch black.
Yup.
And in the middle of the night, it would flick on, and we were in a studio, so we could see the light underneath our front door, and it would go boop, 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 and nobody was out there. We would have heard people, and also on our floor, people didn't go out late or anything like that. It was a relatively quiet building, but yeah, didn't you have a camera problem one time in that hallway too because of that entity?
No, it's because I had a camera problem.
Oh, okay. I thought there was something to
We'll
that.
call it
I remember that.
Yes.
a ghostly problem.
Sure,
with your
absolutely.
camera.
But yeah, what's your theory, Chris?
So, interestingly enough, I had a friend who was sensitive, and her sensitivity had her. She was more reluctant about it. She was a no person. So it was twofold. She ended up moving away from Savannah because she felt that oppressive nature of the spirits here, but she was getting locked out of her apartment a lot. And she was trying to figure out, and it was one of those things where her key was oftentimes like trying to turn her key for some reason was very like, which is, old buildings, sure, that's likely, but sometimes it'd be like easy to lock and then very hard to unlock, and things like it would just seem weird to her, but she also felt that there was something on the other side, like holding the deadbolt. And so I posited this theory to her that there's a spirit that understands that you have the sensitivity, that you have the vision, that you could see things, and it's guilty of something. Ooh. And it's trying to keep you from uncovering the truth about something it did in life. But it's also probably the exact same reason why it's trapped here, is because the truth is hidden. And if it's actively trying to hide the truth, it was probably something bad. This spirit did something bad in its life, but does not want anyone to know. And it cannot move on until someone knows. So it is a duality issue. It's going to be there for as long as no one knows, but it's going to keep people from finding out because it's ashamed or guilty.
That's very interesting.
No, for real.
Yeah, that building was like over 100 years old.
Yeah, it was.
So
it was
and it was right on Forsyth Park. So there is a number of reasons why that could have been haunted.
Because it's such an interesting dilemma, because the other ghost that you speak about a lot, Jim, was guilty of opening doors, unlocking doors, desperate for you to know the truth, desperate for you to, help him get out. Somebody locking a door is a different entity, is a different concept. There's something different driving it. And it just reads that, especially for somebody who's sensitive, if the spirits know that you can suss out or witness or see something, the ones that want you to see will keep the doors unlocked, and the ones that don't want you to see will try to lock the doors. And again, for anybody listening who wants to chime in on that, don't. It's a theory. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I fully admit, it could be absolutely wrong.
It does make a lot of sense, though, I will say. And, and like we always say, we're speculating here. But
it's all speculation.
We talk about our experiences, but we can only make of so much sense of certain things. And some things are just not explainable.
And that's the whole thing. Every theory that I've ever come up with was to make sense of X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
It's not, I've discovered. It's, this satisfies my curiosity. I can move on because I came up with an answer that suits me. And if it suits you, if it helps you, great. If it doesn't, fine.
Yeah.
But know that I'm not going to defend this. It's not a hill I'm going to die on.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So before we move on, let us know a little bit more about what a parasitic spirit is.
So a parasitic spirit is typically something, like it could have been somebody who was alive at some point. It also could be an entity that has never been alive. But typically they are very low energy beings that are so desperate for any type of energy. So they oftentimes will attach themselves to people to drain that energy from them. It's oftentimes they will do overly, I guess, like things that cause a scene, a ruckus of sorts, to get your attention.
Grabbing your attention, yeah.
Yeah, something that, will exert fear out of you, because fear is like the best thing they can get out of you, because it exerts so much energy that they can take. And so they just are basically constantly looking at ways to drain you of energy, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
And children are especially susceptible because the access point to a child for these spirits are very easy. Sometimes it's very hard to get an adult to pay attention. But children are they're closer to the source, we'll say, and that gives them ease of access for these spirits. They are, I find, when you're dealing with non-human entities, these are the real baddies, the ones that are feeding off of that energy. And it is, I believe that human attention is probably the greatest source of nourishment for a supernatural entity, because it just seems to be that that initial fright, that boo, is like, and you've just exerted all this energy towards it, and then it can just kind of recede into full belly syndrome. It's just off in the corner waiting until it needs to feed again. So yeah, I would say that a parasitic entity 9 times out of 10 is an inhuman, and then that 10th time is a human that had lost all humanity. So it's no longer human. I think that human spirits that kind of lose sight of empathy, sympathy, love, joy, all those things, becomes parasitic.
Wow.
In that nature.
Okay. Thank you for the explanation. I am really, really excited, because here is the surprise, y'all.
Okay.
Very, very stoked about this. On our Patreon a couple days ago, we announced to the patrons that they would be able to give us their ghost stories, and we were going to read them on the podcast. And we got our first ghost story that we're going to read on this podcast from a patron. So thank you so much to Alicia Beham. She's one of our newer patrons. And Madison, I'm going to go ahead and let you read her story.
All right. This is also the first time I'm seeing this, just for your knowledge. But back in 2009, I traveled to Saskatchewan, Canada, to visit some friends. One of the things they like to do was ghost hunt, and they told me about this one place called Fort San. It was an abandoned tuberculosis hospital. Oof. They told me they often heard or seen weird things when they would go. At the time, someone had bought Fort San and was turning it into an old folks' home. I don't think that worked out in the end. I can imagine. So one night we drove up to Fort San and parked on the side of the road. The light to the old doctor's office was on, which was strange, but they were in the process of revamping the place. We stepped out of the car and walked up towards the pathway. All of a sudden, we could hear wailing from afar, like someone was in pain. And we stood there for a moment until we heard someone breathing heavily, and it kept getting louder and closer to us. We didn't see anything, but we both looked at each other to confirm that we were hearing it. This was on the side of the road outside of the place, and we were already experiencing weird sounds. My friend wanted to go inside, but I got too scared, and so we left.
All right. That was a creepy one. So what do y'all think?
That is very creepy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty common in a place that has had such deep trauma, like a tuberculosis hospital, where you're going to have a lot of activity there. We talk about often how oftentimes when traumatic incidents are really, just like an incident that takes a lot of energy out of a person, it really affects someone, it can leave kind of an impression behind. And so when you get hospitals or mental institutions or places like that, I feel like a lot of times why they become so haunted is because there's so many residual hauntings occurring there. It is interesting that you experience this outside of the building, but it doesn't necessarily negate the fact that it could have been a guard, it could have been a nurse walking into the hospital. It could have been a patient where they let them outside for a period of time or whatever it be. And breathing is such a human thing. Obviously, we need air to breathe, and we breathe constantly or we're dead. You know, I feel like we hear a lot of these spirits and we experience them breathing because obviously that's like the most human thing you can have. It's the most human residual haunting you can experience. So you're probably just experiencing a person in whatever they were doing, but you're just getting that little taste of it. It's just a little indication of it.
Awesome.
Yeah, it seems to me the longer a place harbors suffering, the more intense that energy is going to be. When you think about like a tuberculosis hospital, especially, you know, the turn of the 19th, 20th century era or early 20th century, it was a kind of a death sentence in a lot of ways when you were finally taken to the tuberculosis hospital. You were not taken there to improve. Oftentimes you were taken there so that people didn't have to watch you die. But it takes a while. And there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of knowledge of your own death. And I've mentioned that the path to death is a door opening. So let's say, you know, I jump up and I stab someone. That's a spike. The door open and shut. And that stab is oftentimes enough of an emotional moment for all of the activity that's going to come. However, when you're suffering a slow death, the door is creaking open. It's opening to the other side so slowly that any number of things can come in. And at the moment of death, the door will slam when you pass on to the other side. Or if you choose not to, it'll still slam. All that buildup is now in the environment. And when you have a lot of suffering, it literally stains the walls. It literally stains the land. And what's interesting is we just spoke to Emma about an insane asylum in Ireland where people would hear the wailing and the screaming from outside the walls. That is another thing about these types of institutions, is that the impression from outside the building, people who live in the neighboring areas or just go by or just know what the building is, they have put their focus on the sadness of the place, on the scariness of the place. They put a dark shadow on the place because it is a place of death and suffering. It is a place of, you know, just hopelessness. And that collective energy is going to leave a mark. And so when you go poking in those, you know, areas, you're going to find ghosts. I have found, too, that colder climate places have very hardy ghosts. Like our ghosts in Savannah, they are present, but they're also very southern drawl. I'll say, boo, y'all. and that gives you this kind of like, oh, they're all around. You know, you can imagine them carrying a, you know, mint julep and being like, I'm a ghost, and just sipping away.
That sounds
But you go
right.
to some place like, you know, I had some ghost experiences in Connecticut and Kansas, places that are hard to live in. So those ghosts are hardy and hard, you know, because, you know, when it gets cold, it's cold. And when it's harsh. And then you get these ghosts that are a little more aggressively present, you know, because they know how to be. So and it's such a weird thing to say that, you know, there's some hardy ghosts out there, but there are far more hardy ghosts. Because like in Savannah, I think also we pay attention to our ghosts. So they're not like starving for attention. We tell their stories, we acknowledge them, we recognize them. In other places, they're shunned. They're like, you don't exist. And so they're like, oh, I do, and I'm going to show you. So you're going to encounter these things oftentimes. And I think I gave a ghost hunting tip that ghost hunting in the cold is more likely to yield results than ghost hunting in the real heavy heat, and that is because you can draw ghosts with your presence in the cold, whereas the heat, ghosts can just feed themselves. You know, that's how you get a cold spot, is the ghosts are pulling the ambient temperature out of the air to feed themselves, to nourish themselves. This does mean, though, that you're more likely to maybe see or experience a ghost because that, you know, heat draw gave that ghost enough energy to do things. But But if you want to be bait, if you want to be ghost bait, you should go out and try to investigate in the cold.
I would definitely also say residual hauntings are not just limited to like spirits walking around or things like that. A lot of people forget that residual hauntings can be smells. They can be just sounds and things of that. Exactly. So and the best way to explain a residual haunting, and I'm pretty sure I've given this analogy before, but the way that I like to tell people how it works is, you know how a snake sheds its skin. The skin is left behind, and we can experience that, but we're not seeing the snake. So it's just that little bit of the essence of what was there. So if you're hearing wailing and stuff, it more than likely, it's not necessarily like hundreds of ghosts just screaming at the same time. It's probably just an echo of what was there, that's just playing on a loop for...
Yeah, I want to say that there's a type of pottery where they put a phonograph needle on it and heard the sound of the people making the pottery. I at this point, I'm like, is that true? It might be. But the idea is very similar, is the idea of, just recording sound, or, we used to record on tape. Back in the day, we'd put a cassette in a tape recorder and we'd press the record button. And I think that's kind of what an environment does, is it records a moment, and it can be played back under the right circumstances, where when the environment is the same as when the recording was made.
Sure.
That makes it accessible for us to see, and that is, one of these amazingly. We're close. We're so close to figuring this one out. It's going to be commonplace one day. Listening to the dead, listening to ghosts. I feel like we're this close to figuring out that time is a recording, and we should be able to play back things that have happened.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And everything is also energy. So, that guy who connects his little energy readers that makes it into music to mushrooms, same idea. So we are all just mushrooms. So
Hashtag mushrooms.
Hashtag mushrooms. But yeah, thank you guys for submitting your questions, and thank you, Alicia, for sending us your awesome story. If you guys have a ghost story like that, please send it over to us. We love reading that. For those of you on Patreon, definitely send us your ghost stories. No matter if you think it's too insignificant or it's whatever, we'd love to hear it. So definitely send that over. But we're going to go ahead and wrap things up. So definitely check us out on Patreon and consider becoming a patron if you haven't already. We release new content way earlier than anybody else gets to see it on there. We get exclusive content. There's going to be vlogs. There's all sorts of fun things. There's polls. We interact with you guys. So if you just want to talk to us, another great reason to become a patron. You can find us at patreon.com/SavannahUnderground. As always, follow us on TikTok and Instagram. And Chris, you got a ghost tip?
Yes, most people will believe that there are certain items and certain things that will ward off evil spirits, and there are a grand number of traditions for that. But what I have found effective is the things that make you feel safe, which is interesting because I have been on ghost hunts with a baseball bat, because the baseball bat made me feel safe. What enforces our confidence is not readily recognizable by the spirits. What they do know is that we're confident. So it is about what makes you feel secure. And you can threaten ghosts, you can tell them to leave you alone, and it's all about how much conviction you have. And if you have a baseball bat in your hand, you might be a little more convincing.
Well, there you go. Always travel with a baseball bat against ghosts. So with that being said, thank you guys again. As always, thank you for listening. And my name is Madison Timmons.
I'm Chris Soucy.
And stay spooky, y'all.